All right. Hi, everybody. Letting folks come in from the waiting room there. So hello, welcome. My name is Becca Watts. I am the director of the Progressive Talent Pipeline. On behalf of Progressive Talent Pipeline, Public Money Action, and the Revolving Door Project, I just want to welcome you all to our briefing tonight, Progressive Approaches to the Debt Ceiling, a briefing on the options to avoid default. I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's involved in putting this event together, to all of our speakers tonight, and all of you for joining us on a Wednesday evening. So a very brief overview of what we're going to be talking about this evening. We're going to start out with an introduction to the debt limit. We're going to hear about various progressive proposals to avoid default. We'll hear an update from the Congressional Progressive Caucus perspective on legislative dynamics, and we'll have some time for a question and answer session. So a few housekeeping things before we get started. So this event will be held under the Chatham House rule. And so the idea of that is you share the information you receive, but not revealing the identity of who said it or other participants without their permission. This event is being recorded. We will stop that recording ahead of Q&A. And since we are doing the question and answer, do feel free to drop questions in the chat as we're going. We will be compiling those questions for when we get to that section. And so with that, I will turn it over now to Marie-Therese, who is going to be moderating tonight, and let her introduce herself. All right, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Becca. And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, for joining the 0.001% of people who attend economic policy briefings for fun after hours. My name is Therese Kane, she, her. I'm an organizer with Public Money Action. I'm also a former Hill staffer. I served on the Democratic staff of the Senate Banking Committee during the 117th Congress and covered the coinage portfolio, which is a bit relevant to tonight's discussion. Currently, I work at the Sierra Club on economic and climate policy, and I'll be moderating in a personal capacity. It's great to see such a diverse audience of folks from different agencies and congressional offices, Senate and House side. If you're somebody who's been following debt limit debates for many Congresses now and kind of can't imagine how we will overcome the brinkmanship, then you're definitely in the right place. If you're newer to these issues, maybe you've seen the debt limit mentioned in Politico newsletters or on the CNN ticker waiting for your coffee. But don't quite get like what the debt limit is or what it means for the government to borrow money. You're also in the right place. We want this to be a space of shared learning and strategic discussion, and ultimately sort of laying some intellectual groundwork for future action together. So thank you again for making time. The goal, I guess, of tonight's event, I think, is threefold. First, we want to demystify what the debt limit is and isn't. And why we should care and sort of reclaim it as something that we all have a stake in. The way that it's been used as a political tool in the past has profound implications for ordinary people's lives, both in terms of what's at stake if we risk default with different payments and programs, but also because the narrow logic behind the debt limit reinforces a misguided sort of view of economics that ultimately is a big speed bump to the kind of progressive policies that we want and need and that many of you spend your days working on. So that's the first part. Second part, we're going to talk about a compelling suite of progressive policy proposals to avoid default and free us from the toxic political dynamics that we're currently trapped in. And so these proposals are going to be progressive in the sense that I think all of our speakers take for granted that the current political dynamics are undesirable and something we should seek to fix, and that we should take action to minimize the potential for default or take the option of default off the table entirely. So that's kind of the space that we're operating in here. And then finally, we're going to hear a little bit about what's happening on the ground in Congress and in the executive branch, and sort of step into our power as executive and congressional staffers and brainstorm sort of what organizing together around this could look like in terms of creative solutions this Congress and beyond. I think as staffers, and for many of you, maybe junior staffers, it can be thrilling to be sort of in the belly of the beast and in like the room where it happens with all these different sorts of discussions, but it also can be overwhelming to know sort of how to influence maybe more closed door discussions and understand your role from within in affecting change. And so I think unlike people who have to watch this all play out on the news, we are in a unique position in that we have tools at our disposal individually and collectively by being in the government to sort of organize people around ideas. And so I hope you kind of walk away from tonight with sort of an understanding that there is a bench of policy experts here to provide analysis, that you have sort of a community of peers to co-conspire with and strategize with, and ultimately that I think the public interest is on our side as well. I think most people want a balanced and robust economy. They want the US to have a stable role in the global financial system. They want economic freedoms and good infrastructure, public supports to be able to sort of live their lives and support their families. And so I think that those things are only possible in the long run if we free ourselves from sort of the traps that the debt limit imposes on our imagination when it comes to public finance. So if you care about, as I said, Green New Deal, healthcare, immigration, this is your fight, because this is kind of the way in which we will get those things. So with that, I think we should just dive in. We have 4 great panelists who have joined us, and feel free to wave when I call your name. Rohan Grey is an assistant professor of law at Willamette University and the preeminent legal scholar on the $1 trillion coin proposal. Jeff Hauser is joining us. He's the executive director for the Revolving Door Project, which scrutinizes executive branch appointees to ensure that they use their office to serve the public interest over corporate power or personal advancement. Nathan Tankus is research director for the Modern Money Network and is repping the logo strongly for PMA, a group that aims to bring knowledge of monetary and financial systems to the public. He's also an independent analyst, notable for the Notes on the Crises publication. And finally, Keane Bhatt is policy director for the Congressional Progressive Caucus and former communications director for Senator Bernie Sanders. So I will now pass the mic to Rohan. Rohan, maybe you can kind of begin by giving us a brief introduction to what the debt limit is, what it was originally intended for, and how it reemerged in 2011 as a political fight that's been recurring ever since. So if you want to start there and then kind of dive into your proposal for how we should solve this problem.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Marie-Therese. And thank you everyone for coming out on a Wednesday night. I'm on the West Coast, so it's a little bit earlier here. I understand the level of commitment it must take to be interested in these issues at 8 p.m. after a hard day's work and a very busy week. So starting from the very beginning, and please feel free to ask any questions along the way. The basic kind of 6th grade social science, how a bill becomes a law. The legislature passes a budget, and historically speaking, the budget would have 2 components. First of all, it would have what is to be spent on. You would have to spend this amount on these things, this amount on these other things. But for our purposes, the more important part historically was the financing authority. And for a very long period of time, until the early 20th century, these 2 things were passed in parallel but separately. So you would say, we're going to spend, $100 million on the Department of Defense or something like that. And then you would have a second bill that would say, we authorize the issuance of a certain amount of instruments, debt securities, or revenue sources like taxes or customs. And the 2 were kind of paired with each other. So every spending bill had its own separate financing bill. You could point to the authority for the canal with the Canal Financing Act. And there was a period in the early 20th century where this authority was consolidated, mostly to deal with the increased complexity of the US government. After World War I and then in the lead up to World War II, the idea was that rather than giving the executive branch thousands of individual spending authorities, you would give them one general financing authority, and they would use that to honor the various spending commitments. And so this kind of idea that we have today, where the debt ceiling is a limit on how much to spend or how much to issue debt, is almost actually backwards from where it began. It began as a way to give the executive branch greater discretion in how to honor Congress's spending commitments. That is to say, Congress would say you can only spend a certain amount, no more, no less. It's sort of like Goldilocks. But the way that you finance it, we don't care. We're increasingly ambivalent. If you choose to do it with $100 bills, $50 bills, $20 bills, short-term debt, long-term debt, we don't really care. You can't tax more than we tell you to tax. You can't spend more or less than we tell you to spend. But when it comes to the financing instrument, we think that's largely an executive discretionary issue. The problem was, and maybe some of you have had this experience in other areas of policy, once you create something to solve one problem, it quickly gets turned into its own political football for other purposes. So the minute that the debt ceiling was created, 1939 was really sort of solidified as one big debt ceiling. It almost immediately started being weaponized for political purposes. So the first kind of big debt ceiling fight was actually in the 1950s with Senator Robert Byrd. Maybe that name's familiar to some of you. And at that point, there was a series of accounting gimmicks around gold certificates that were used to get around it. But for a long period of time, the kind of showdowns over raising the debt ceiling were mostly an excuse for Congress to grumble about spending commitments or things that they wanted to change, but they would ultimately raise the debt ceiling. By the 1980s, however, the debt ceiling had been codified into law. All the various different authorities that had consolidated were made explicitly in one authority, and you can find it in 31 USC 3101, public debt subject to limit. You can see it here, the face amount of obligations, blah, 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 blah. This authority became a kind of flashpoint, and you started seeing more intense political fights around it, most notably in the Reagan era, where eventually the Treasury Secretary resorted to what they called extraordinary measures to basically prolong the government's ability to finance itself under normal operations while these negotiations dragged out. At one point, interestingly, and it will come back probably later, the Government Accountability Office did a review of one of these extraordinary measures that moved some funds around from a Social Security account, determined it was probably illegal. But they said, given the extraordinary circumstances, we understand why the Treasury Secretary needed to do it. So what we have today, and this is sort of post the Obama era, which, you know, without getting too much into the racial politics, I think was because the Republicans both didn't want to give the first black president a big win, but also knew that they were going to lose the popular vote over time, really solidified this into a kind of hardball moment where unless the prevailing party in power agreed to concessions, they would refuse to raise the ceiling. And so what we have now is this idea that some scholars have called a trilemma, a kind of impossible trinity, which is Congress tells the executive branch to spend a certain amount, it tells them to tax a certain amount, and it says you have to make up the difference, at least ostensibly, with issuing Treasury securities, issuing debt that is subject to that limit. The problem, of course, arises when the limit doesn't actually cover the difference, right? A minus B is a certain amount, but the C that you can issue is too small. And that's when we have this kind of breakage. So the normal way that we would think about this is, in that moment, Congress needs to step up. They need to basically go back to the plate and pass new legislation increasing that limit so that the difference can be made up. In other countries, interestingly, and you maybe can tell by my accent, I'm from another country, we would have in parliamentary system what's called a double dissolution. There would be a whole snap election if there was a budget crisis like this, but in the United States system, it doesn't work like that. But what we have now is a system where essentially you have this perceived impossibility that you have to break one of these options. And then we get into all these very kind of complicated debates about which one we should break. What I'm here to suggest is this is a false dilemma. This is a false crisis. The reality is that there is a fourth option. And if you take a moment and sort of think, you will hear the thing that is missing. For governments to meet their budget obligations, they must be able to spend, tax, and borrow. What's missing here is creating the money itself. You can't tax money that isn't already in existence. You can't borrow money that isn't already in existence. But where is the government's power to create money in this story? The assumption or the sort of implicit framing is that the money is already just out there. There's a certain amount. But we know very well, and as we've seen just recently with the Silicon Valley Bank crisis, and certainly in 2020, and certainly in 2008, when the time comes, when the crisis moment hits, the government pulls out its infinity money cannon, as former Minneapolis President Neil Kashkari calls it, and can make money out of thin air, right? Money that isn't quote unquote taxpayer money, money that doesn't come from bond markets or anything else. So the question then becomes, why is it that when we are looking at the budget, we don't look at other powers beyond the debt ceiling? The general assumption that you probably would kind of reach is, we think that there is something fundamentally different between printing money and issuing debt. One is inflationary, right? That's what undergrad econ says, that when you print money, it's inflationary. But if you issue debt, you're just taking existing money and moving it around. Well, let's take a second. And if you look at the debt limit, the public debt limit, what they talk about is a term here, a legal term that's very important. They call it obligations, the face amount of obligations issued under this chapter. They don't say debt in general, they say obligations. Now, what if we look at the other obligations that exist on the debts in this part of the Act? We have bonds, notes, certificates of indebtedness, treasury bills, savings bonds. These are the things that are covered by the debt ceiling. These are the instruments that are referred to. It's like saying you can only have green pieces of paper issued up to a certain amount. But if we look at the legal term obligation under US Code 18, Section 8, we see actually a much wider range of instruments. First of all, we see Federal Reserve notes. These are the dollars in your pocket. We see treasury notes. We see gold certificates. We see bills, checks, things. We even see stamps here, things that by all accounts do not and have never been subject to the debt limit. So what I want to suggest to you to hopefully frame this conversation is that the debt limit is not a limit on quote unquote borrowing, and it is certainly not a limit on running a deficit. What it is a limit on issuing a certain category of instruments, a certain class of instruments. It is a limit on a fraction of the overall way that we could issue forms of financial instruments to run the government. So what's another kind of instrument that is not under the debt ceiling, in addition to Federal Reserve notes, that we could issue? The Federal Reserve notes are issued by the Fed, right? There's a complicated legal structure there. Historically speaking, the Treasury actually used to issue their own version of paper money called currency notes. They were called greenbacks, right? They almost look identical to Federal Reserve notes. They were phased out in the mid-20th century. But there is another kind of very prominent instrument that is issued by the Treasury that is not subject to the debt ceiling, and that is coins, right? The Coinage Act, and you can find it, has all sorts of coins here, everything from pennies through to individual dollars, etc., that are not subject to the debt ceiling and can be issued in all sorts of quantities. Interestingly enough, the US Mint was the oldest monetary institution in the US government. It preceded the Treasury. It wasn't part of the Treasury back then. It was its own entity. It certainly preceded the Fed, and it even preceded the Bureau of Engraving and Printing that makes the paper money by about 80 years, 70 years. So the Treasury, the Mint is actually the entity that today has the widest authority to issue instruments not subject to the debt ceiling. And it's all to do with one provision. This is the kind of thing that keeps law professors like me in business. This provision is Section K of the Coinage Act, and it was passed by a very visionary mint director in the 90s called Philip Deal. He did so knowing that this was unprecedented legal authority. And that says, as you read it carefully, may mint and issue platinum, bullion coins, and proof platinum coins. Proof here just means high quality. It's very shiny. In accordance with such specifications, designs, varieties, quantities, denominations, and inscriptions as the Secretary may prescribe from time to time. So take a moment and just, if you didn't know anything else about the government and you read this language, the Secretary may mint coins in whatever quantities and denominations as the Secretary in their discretion may prescribe. Would you think there's any limit there? Does that say only up to $100, only up to $1,000, only on weekends, only on odd numbered days of the year? Or does it say the Treasury Secretary can do this whenever they need to? So Mike's kind of argument, and the argument of the people involved with me who talk about minting the coin as a solution here, is that we have been talking about the debt ceiling as though it is this existential constraint on the government, that until we can get Congress to come back to the table somehow, until we convince Kevin McCarthy and all of his people to come back to the table and help out a Democratic Party president. I mean, it sounds ridiculous when you say it that way, but that's what we're essentially hoping. Help them out, that we won't be able to fund the government. Meanwhile, there is legal authority on the table that says that you can issue whatever coins you need at the Treasury and create the money that will then be available to spend. So the only question remains is this something we should be doing? Is this something that is better than the current way that we do things? And this is where I think you need to sort of take a step back and look at the actual situation we're in. We are talking about violating congressional directive to spend a certain amount of money. That's the place that the party is at right now. The Democratic Party is talking about, quote unquote, prioritizing payments, which is another way of saying selectively defaulting. We have run out of options. Unless the Republicans come to the table, unless they blink in this game of chicken where we're going 100 miles an hour at each other on a highway, the only other option that the party is seriously considering right now is defaulting. There is a pretty good argument, and I think Jeff's going to talk about this in more detail, that the 14th Amendment actually prevents that from even being a constitutional possibility. Not something that is unwise, not something the president and the Treasury Secretary can be very unhappy about, but begrudgingly do, that they actually don't have the authority. When Congress says to spend, the executive branch must spend. This is in the Constitution, and it goes back in Supreme Court precedent to 1838 with a case called Kendall v. Stokes, where the court said when Congress has directed a certain amount of money be spent, the executive branch has no constitutional power not to spend it. So I hope we can talk about some of the reasons why people might feel angsty about the coin in more detail later. But I will want to end on this one note, which is we spend a lot of time in the media talking about the idea of minting $1 trillion coin. And the goal with that is partially a kind of symbolic marketing kind of framing to cut through the noise. And I think the fact that this has cut through the noise, maybe some of you have heard about this, maybe friends have heard about it, maybe even people on the subway have been able to kind of keep it in their memory, despite this topic being so boring, most people's eyes glaze over when they try to understand any of it. When we actually come to implementation, we can be quite reasonable and moderate about this. So the last thing I want to suggest is a sort of three-phase vision. Rather than one huge coin that scares everybody with the word trillion in it, we issue a small number of coins on a monthly basis or daily basis until the X date, until we hit that moment when every other option is exhausted. But all that coin money, all the financing does not get spent. It gets put in a fund that the president calls the emergency fund, the emergency debt limit fund. We could even add the word national security in there if we have to, just to really kind of ham it up for the Republicans. The emergency national security debt limit fund. And the president says, I really don't want to use this. I think this is silly. We shouldn't have to use this. We should be doing business as usual. But if the alternative is default, which I'm actually not allowed to even think about, yet alone do, then this is the nuclear option. This is the red button that I press when everything else fails. And he slowly fills that up over the next few months. If we have to go to court, we do court challenges, etc. And then when we hit that X date, when everything else runs out, we stop and we say, okay, we are going to start a clock right now. We are going to switch to that emergency fund, and we're going to do one last round of negotiations. We are going to try to come to the table in good faith. And if that negotiation fails, when that fund runs out, we're going to switch to coin financing permanently, because this is not a good way to run a government. This is not a good way to run a country. And we actually don't have the constitutional authority to continue to hold up the budget. The correct place to fight about the budget is with the budget process. Once the legislature passes that budget, the executive branch must execute. So I'll stop there and happy to have more questions in the follow-up. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rohan. And yeah, we can always loop back to you. I think that's helpful to understand that the debt limit is sort of a limit on only on certain sorts of government obligations, and that coinage is sort of one of the forms in which we could work around that and continue to sort of do what we need to do to operate the government. And I like the idea of minting many coins visually is a very fun idea. So now I think we'll pass to Jeff. You have also written about the debt limit, and you've said that the debt limit sort of at face value is incoherent or unconstitutional, if I'm correct. And so I'd love for you to walk us through that perspective and sort of what you think should be done based on that analysis.
Sure. And much of what I'm going to say is very consistent with what Rohan just said. In Washington, it seems to be believed that the only law that is good law is the debt ceiling. And ironically, no one actually believes in the debt ceiling. No one actually says that the final amount of debt that the United States should issue is going to be reached this summer, and spending must be balanced going forward. Even Kevin McCarthy, at his least serious and policy statements, is not suggesting an actual balanced budget. He is quite clear that he wants policy concessions in order to avoid a policy outcome that he believes is undesirable. So we are dealing with a kabuki situation in which no one believes the debt ceiling is good as a policy matter. Journalists all believe it is unserious as a policy process. And as Rohan was suggesting, it is also legally incoherent. Why is it legally incoherent? There are 3 laws, roughly. There are laws about taxes, there are laws about spending, there is the debt ceiling. You cannot satisfy more than 2 at the same time. And what Mike Dorff and Neil Buchanan, a couple of law professors, like to say is that ignoring the debt ceiling and pretending it, or just saying it is null and void, and I'll get into why you can do that, is the least unconstitutional way forward, because it's just a simple law that you are saying we cannot implement, because it contradicts the command that the president spend the money that Congress appropriated. But why is it less unconstitutional to ignore the debt ceiling? Well, first you have to think about the fact that laws often contradict each other. And there are legal tools to try to figure out, what do you do when laws contradict each other? One principle is that the more recent law is more relevant than the older law. The last or later in time rule is a tool of statutory construction to help us deal with these sort of thickets of problems. The omnibus passed Congress on December 29th of 2022. Congress last raised the debt ceiling December 16th of 2021. So the omnibus that governs the spending of the US government is more recent by more than a year. So they knew that it was going to be the case that within the course of the money that they were telling the executive branch to spend, that the debt ceiling was going to be achieved. They did not give instructions to the president on what to do at that point in time. They just set up a situation in which either they did not mean the debt ceiling to be serious or to permit hostages to be taken. But the more recent bill is a command by Congress that the president spend a certain amount of money, which will take us, given our current level of taxation, past the debt ceiling. That is important. Second, specific laws are always interpreted to, or as a general principle, are interpreted to supersede general laws. And this is just logical. If you tell somebody very specifically, do this one thing, even if you said, generally speaking, don't do that thing, don't do a class of things which that specific thing is included in, if more specific instructions supersede general rules. That principle is also embedded in the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. And yes, this is a boring congressional title from so long ago, that's the year that I was born, 1974. But that was a bill passed because Nixon, in one of his many scandals, it wasn't just Watergate, refused to spend money, that is, execute appropriations that had been duly passed by Congress and signed into law as part of his imperial approach to the presidency. Nixon had to sign this bill to get Congress off his back because he had to accede to the notion that even though he believed in an imperial presidency, there was an enormous political consensus and a judicial consensus that the president cannot pick and choose what spending to implement. So with that backdrop, with a law that says the president can't pick and choose, with a command that President Biden spend money that will take him past the debt limit, and with the president limited in implementing taxes to a certain amount of taxes that will not cover the spending once the debt limit is reached, what is the president to do to minimize the constitutional problem? And I would argue saying that, look, I'm going to follow the most recent command. You gave me contradictory commands. You said this, and then more recently you said that. The more recent thing, that's what I'm going to follow. I think that works fine. That does not mean by any stretch that I oppose minting the coin or any other interesting measures, or it's not even unusual, but just I support any effort to treat the debt ceiling as the legal nullity I believe it to be. There's another doctrine called the absurd result canon, which is that if a legislature is unlikely to intend a manifestly unjust or absurd result, don't interpret the statute that that's what it means. And again, it's crazy to go to great lengths to compel spending on projects that is the very detailed, hundreds of pages budget that cannot be spent without issuing debt. The fact that McCarthy is clear that he is not actually seeking to limit the debt at a certain amount kind of gives the game away. He is talking about this as solely hostage that is to be taken as a process point, but he is not saying that the debt ceiling was meant in a literal or serious sense. So given that it would require the president to violate the Budget Act, to illegally impound money, that's crazy. Furthermore, the Supreme Court has in the past ruled that the line item veto, even when passed by Congress, is illegal because the president cannot intervene in the budgetary process and stop spending. But if and when the debt ceiling were to be taken seriously, if we do not mint the coin or do any number of other measures, then the president would have to say, I want to pay this bill, I'm going to pay that bill, and just move along and make constant decisions. It would be imperial. It would be completely at odds with the power of the purse that is so important to our constitutional separation of powers. In no other context would courts rule that sort of action by the president to be legal. It is clearly absurd. It is unconstitutional. Moreover, as Rohan referenced, the 14th Amendment says that you cannot call into question the debt of the US, and that includes obligations such as Social Security payments or VA benefits and any number of other aspects of the budget. So you'd be violating constitutional principles of the separation of powers of the 14th Amendment. You'd be violating the Budget Control and Impoundment Act. Why do we think that the debt ceiling law that has been superseded by the omnibus is so powerful and so important that it authorizes the president to violate multiple aspects of the Constitution and other laws that are either more specific or more recent or both? A Supreme Court that strongly believes in a non-delegation doctrine, I think it's an absurd doctrine, but they are very clear that Congress cannot punt authorities to the president, that some powers are inherently congressional. No power is more inherently congressional than the power of the purse. And finally, so for all these reasons, I think that the the debt ceiling is illegitimate. It doesn't exist, and the president should just plow through it as if it doesn't exist. But then your reaction might be, what about the courts? The courts suck. And yes, the courts absolutely suck. But what would the courts be able to tell the president to do? Sure, maybe you get 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court who overturn all of the doctrines that they otherwise believe in, and they say, President Biden, you cannot do this. But what is their alternative? Is the Supreme Court going to write out a 1,000-page appropriation with multiple scenarios on days in which the Treasury takes in a certain amount of taxes? And these are the things you spend on, and on other days, these are the things you spend on. And in a national security emergency, there's no remedy that a court could give to somebody who sues President Biden for failing to respect the debt ceiling. There is no remedy because it is such an incoherent concept. So the debt ceiling, which is being treated in Washington as if it is the most important law, the only law that matters, the law that trumps all other laws, is actually impossible to implement. It is a nullity, and President Biden should treat it as such.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was insightful for those of us who don't have law degrees. I think so. Rowan talked us through sort of one example of how we can avoid brinkmanship. Jeff helped us understand sort of the incoherence of the debt limit just at its face value. And then now we're going to pass to Nathan. If you could kind of speak to, there seem to be some broader applications of these points for the role of public money and spending and the role of the Federal Reserve, which is like the government's bank. So could you kind of help us think about what else might be possible for the executive in light of sort of some of the analyses that have been shared?
Yeah. So I want to, kind of bring this all together by taking like a broader perspective on essentially the payment side of all of these issues. If you follow my writing, you know that I'm also a partisan of issuing $1 trillion platinum coin, basically second only to Rowan as an advocate out there, pushing that perspective. However, there are larger issues at play here that affect all the alternatives to the brinkmanship, to the game of chicken with Republicans, that are worth discussing. And these were drawn out, at least in my view, they were drawn out because of a series of pieces that I wrote at the Financial Times blog that were about the platinum coin, but became a broader conversation. And the essence of this is Janet Yellen's 2021 view, which she repeated in response to Wall Street Journal questions, which I think were essentially inspired by my Financial Times piece, about why she objects to the coin. And what's interesting about her objection to the coin is she does not object to the legality of issuing $1 trillion coin. She has never said that's illegal. She's called it ridiculous. She's called it an accounting gimmick. But those aren't really substantive disagreements. They're just sort of pejoratives. The one actual objection she made was the Federal Reserve might not accept the coin. And this is a very interesting idea because, as was just mentioned, the Federal Reserve is the government's bank. The technical term for that is fiscal agent. They provide all sorts of payment services on our behalf. And in this broader conversation that emerged in this debate, the question emerged and was brought to the forefront in a way that had never been brought before. Well, wait, what is the scope and the limits of the Federal Reserve's obligations as a fiscal agent to the rest of the government, to the Treasury? And this question is essential. And it's not just essential to the platinum coin, in contradiction to a lot of opinions that were expressed a couple of months ago or 6 weeks ago. It's more fundamentally an issue for every one of these proposals, because whether or not or it's depositing $1 trillion coin, whether or not it's issuing Treasury securities and pushing through the debt ceiling because of an invocation of that it's unconstitutional to limit the ability of the government to meet its obligations, whether because of the Constitution, the original text of the Constitution, or because of Section 14, the 14th Amendment, or these kind of quirky options which are attractive to certain type of centrist DC pundit, or just more generally financial thinkers who are attracted to complexity, is the idea of issuing a low face value, high coupon bond. Essentially, the idea is, well, the debt ceiling is a limit on the face value of the obligations, what the dollar amount written on the front. You take a $100 bill, it says $100, the face value is $100. The idea being, and this basically the same principle applies to Treasury securities, even though we don't have physical Treasury securities anymore, which I'll get back to. Instead, you write a low face value, you write $1, but you say that its coupon, it's the interest payments it makes are going to be, say, $100. And then you have an auction, and people can pay far above the face value of the bond. That provides you the funds you need to refill the Treasury's bank account at the Federal Reserve. And voila, we have a way of shrinking the overall face value of the debt while financing the government spending. This is cute. It's a for people who are really interested in essentially financial gimmicks. It's an attractive idea for various reasons and gets away from the broader questions about money that the platinum coin brings up in a broader perspective. But regardless of whether it's this option, whether it's let's just push through and break the debt ceiling, issue Treasury securities, or whether it's depositing $1 trillion coin or whatever kind of platinum coin at a Federal Reserve Bank, all of these require the Federal Reserve to follow its obligations as a result of Section 15 of the Federal Reserve Act as a fiscal agent in providing these payment services. And those payment services are extensive. They also are the ones who operationally deal with auctioning Treasury securities. So you're going to be hard pressed to auction Treasury securities without the Federal Reserve's direct cooperation. They're the ones who track who actually owns the Treasury securities. Because they run the book entry system. They're the ones who and that is important for determining who actually is supposed to be getting interest payments, which the Federal Reserve is responsible for sending those interest payments out. So at all these fundamental levels, whatever alternative to brinkmanship with the Republicans, the Federal Reserve's role as a fiscal agent is essential. And that role is Yellen is saying is that the Federal Reserve is essentially going to compel default, and the Federal Reserve is kind of the enforcer for any sort of unfavorable court decision by simply refusing to cooperate with issuing Treasury securities or accepting the coin or whatever else you need to fill up the Treasury's bank account. That's an extreme claim. It's a violation of multiple parts of the Federal Reserve Act, as well as overriding various powers that the Treasury has. And I think it's an interpretation that's untenable. And further, no one really believes it. Jay Powell would never do that. And ultimately is a red herring from just that is designed to politically distract from the fact that they have tools to move past brinkmanship and to take away the hostage from the Republicans.
Awesome. Sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself. Thank you so much for outlining that. So it seems like you're placing sort of the emphasis on the Federal Reserve as sort of having the authority, and it's this question of like, will they accept the coin, or will they choose to like follow what in statute sort of they would have to do, should be something that we like do not conceive as.
Will they accept the coin? Will they accept breaking the debt ceiling? Will they even accept issuing low face value, high coupon bonds? Will they accept any of these proposed workarounds? And the idea of them having the authority not to puts them in a profound choke point over the rest of the government, which has never been intended by any statute or constitutional provision at all. It's actually a very extreme, insane idea, but it's been invoked to do things, not to take the coin off the table, but it has much more profound implications than the coin that are just very important to politically reject.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. That helps to clarify. Great. And so I think with that, we wrap our sort of 3 proposals for how to, I guess, resolve, so to speak, the debt limit crisis, more so from like a policy standpoint. Now we're going to pass to Keane, who's going to give us some insight into the strategy. We've been talking kind of about the legal side of things, but now let's talk about the tactics. So Keane, you've been involved in these fights before, I guess, and it seems like this Congress we're in a little bit of a new context. Could you kind of share what you're hearing from where you stand in the Congressional Progressive Caucus, how sort of you all are thinking about this issue, and what's missing in your point of view when it comes to congressional action?
Yeah, thank you. And great to be with all of you and to hear from our excellent panelists on some of these proposals. In terms of this Congress, I think what's interesting here is that we have a Democratic Senate and a Republican House. And what was interesting in late 2021 was that you had a faction of Republicans who basically realized that the debt ceiling fight was extremely toxic. And so what Mitch McConnell ended up relenting to was a compromise whereby the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats would simply pass the debt ceiling with Democratic votes, and that he basically capitulated and ceded the 60 vote kind of cloture threshold for the debt ceiling on a one-time basis to allow for a simple 50 vote majority to be able to raise that debt ceiling. And that's what ended up happening in late 2021. As panelists have pointed out, including Jeff, it really does explain everything when you see what Speaker McCarthy's latest positions are, and it's transparently and explicitly about using the debt ceiling as a way to extract unrelated policy concessions. And so those are also deeply unpopular. And for example, one of the items that he raised was strengthening work requirements for dependents. So he's talking about work requirements. He's also talking about reducing only non-defense government spending. Okay. And he's also talking about completely extraneous issues like securing the border and invoking fentanyl. And so what it really does show is a kind of a desperation. And I'm going to share that letter, which just came out this week to President Biden. And so he's at this point kind of pleading that the president's on the clock and that he needs to drop the partisanship and roll up his sleeves. And he asks the president to have his team reach out to the speaker's team by the end of the week to set up a new meeting. So this is kind of an interesting moment, and it does create an opening into seeing what the kinds of divisions and fractures and some of the flailing is among Republicans who understand, that this is a very complicated position, that the Republican conference itself has some very stark divisions in terms of, how it thinks about the budget, where some of its members want to see cuts, how to actually propose a budget. And so right now, I think it's important to kind of highlight some of those politics and some of the partisan dimensions here around this. It's worth pointing out that when Republicans were in the House and in the Senate, they raised the debt ceiling 3 times without any kinds of extraneous policy demands. Through just clean measures to raise the debt ceiling. The fact that they're doing this with a Democratic president and that they're talking about items like work requirements for dependents kind of shows that the goalposts are constantly shifting, that Speaker McCarthy is trying to look for measures that he might be able to kind of consolidate a bulk of his conference around, but that they still don't have a real plan. And not to mention, they're very, very delayed in presenting a budget. And as Jeff and Rowan pointed out, all of these debates happen through the normal appropriations process, and that begins with the House presenting a budget and the president being able to go back and forth through that normal budgetary process on the kinds of items that ultimately end up being appropriated and spent out, pursuant to the Constitution. So I wanted to provide some of that background because I think that clearly these are, very important measures that have to be taken in the event that the hostage takers really don't have a viable, realistic kind of a pathway for extracting some of these pretty bizarre and insane policy concessions, and the kind of selective deployment of concern over the national debt. We are, I'm kind of pleased to be working on a project that is bringing the different ideological wings of the House Democratic Caucus together on a letter that intensifies that pressure on Speaker McCarthy to put forward on the House floor a simple debt ceiling increase without any kinds of poison pill riders that he's kind of proposing to varying degrees on the House floor, and to basically end this hostage taking. We point out a few things in this letter, and we're pleased to have Representative Pramila Jayapal, who's the chair of the Progressive Caucus, partnering with the kind of moderate wing, Annie Kuster, who's the congresswoman who represents the New Democrats coalition. And we're also being joined by Brendan Boyle, who's the ranking member of the House Budget Committee, who maintains jurisdiction over these matters. And as an aside, Ranking Member Boyle actually has introduced on several occasions legislation that would simply strike out the debt ceiling, recognizing its absurdity. And so, those three members are circulating this letter. There's 125 signatories so far, and we're hoping to get more. But what it does is it kind of highlights some of the politics here and elevates the point that House Republicans have already voted on several occasions under President Trump to raise the debt ceiling. That two, the first act of House Republicans was to pass a measure that would rescind funding for the IRS to go after tax evasion by wealthy individuals and corporate tax cheats, and which was estimated by the CEO to increase the deficit by 114 billion over 10 years. So it's clearly an extremely disingenuous and very newfound commitment to concerns over the debt and the deficits that we're seeing from this Republican conference. And then finally, the other point that the president himself has kind of hammered on, which is that this has oftentimes been used as a cudgel to extract very deeply unpopular cuts to Social Security and Medicare. And so some of the most prominent, House Republicans, including, the Republican Study Committee, which represents about 75% of the entire House Republican Conference, have proposed, raising the Social Security age requirement to 70, among other things. And so this is just another kind of a means to an end that is deeply unpopular. And we think that at this stage of the kind of process, it's important to kind of intensify the pressure and to expose the kind of contradictions and the kinds of deeply unpopular policy agendas that the Republicans are trying to pursue through the guise of this kind of artificial crisis. Clearly, I think, a number of progressives have already spoken out on this eventuality of what happens, if McCarthy and, House Republicans, decide to, pursue this hostage taking off of the kind of cliff. And clearly, a lot of these compelling ideas by our panelists merit very serious consideration, and they have enjoyed endorsement by a number of our members, including ranking member of the Judiciary, Jerry Nadler, Brendan Boyle at the Budget Committee, and so on. And so I think there's already a growing understanding that this is an artificial crisis. There's political will among progressive Democrats to abolish this debt ceiling altogether, or to come up with creative solutions so that this kind of inane hostage taking that threatens the kind of global economy is rendered obsolete. So I'm going to stop there. The letter is available and circulating now. So if you are a constituent, you are welcome to speak to your Democratic House member to join this letter. And if you are a staffer, please be in touch with me, and I'm happy to share that information. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Keane, for outlining what the TPC is doing. So it sounds like you all are pushing for pressuring McCarthy to pass a clean debt limit, that you won't stand for concessions, and there's a letter being sent as sort of a way to, it sounds like, both like cohere a base within the Democratic Party and kind of get ducks in a row a little bit, swing some moderates.
That's exactly right. And the other thing that's important is to curb some of the impulses on how to talk about debts and deficits in a way that we believe is unhelpful. So one of the elements of this letter that I think is critical is how we've said that if Republicans are sincere about deficit reduction, then what they would do is support a kind of a strong economic recovery program that has led as a natural byproduct to a reduction in deficits, but that is not an end in and of itself, that the goal is increasing employment, increasing payrolls, reducing the need and the dependence on automatic stabilizing social insurance programs, and increasing tax receipts. And if you have 12 million jobs created and a tight labor market and a full employment kind of an economy, these are the kinds of natural outcomes. And I think the final point that we're also trying to head off is the way that certain Democrats, because of the kind of debt ceiling fight, have been willing in the past to concede to very serious austerity cuts. And so in 2011, we ended up with a very brutal package called the Budget Control Act that resulted from this debt ceiling fight. And that created basically an entire decade of extreme austerity, where we still have barely recovered to the kind of funding levels for domestic programs that were slashed as a result of that fight. So those are the major aims that we're trying to advance. And thankfully, we have an administration that has said that they are not putting any of these kinds of cuts on the table and bringing the fight to Republicans to defend a kind of a deeply unpopular economic program.
Great. No, it's, well, as you're saying, it's like we have the prospect of default and then austerity over here. And it's ironic that I think many of the proposals that we're talking about tonight are oftentimes attacked sort of as being extreme or sort of out of touch. But to me, it seems clear that those are the things that are out of touch, and to do things like use the Treasury's authority to move things around on a balance sheet, or the Fed's authority, or to take this battle even to the court seems much more reasonable. Again, that's highlighting the dynamics, not stating an opinion per se, but that's definitely clear from the remarks. So with that, thank you, Keane. I think we're at time right now, but we'll take another 10 minutes if people are able to stay on and jump to our discussion. So hope that folks will be able to stick with us.